$12. That was all the gas Naomi Sinclair could afford that August afternoon, and she counted the crumpled bills twice before pumping even a single drop. She was 27 years old, 7 months pregnant, and still wearing the faded blue nursing assistant uniform from the double shift that had ended only a few hours earlier, with a gray sweatshirt hanging loosely over it, because it hadn't buttoned since June. On the passenger seat was a cloth bag she never let out of her sight. When the patrol car pulled in behind her and blocked the exit, the officer who stepped out didn't ask whether she needed help. He looked at the old car, looked at the faded uniform, then asked her name before asking for her papers, and it was that order that made her stomach turn cold. She raised both hands to shoulder height, exactly the way her foster mother had taught her when she was little, telling her that people like them had to announce every movement out loud. She said her wallet was inside the car. She said she was going to reach for it very slowly. She said she was pregnant. About 100 feet away, in the shade of an abandoned car wash, a man in a charcoal gray suit stood beside a black sedan and didn't move. He had only stopped for gas on his way back from his mother's grave. He was 34 years old, and in all the years he had spent running what his family ran, no one had ever spoken to him a second time in a tone they lived long enough to regret. He watched her two open palms beneath the sun. He watched the officer's shoulders begin to rise. And he saw the exact second the man realized that this woman wasn't afraid of him. Then a gunshot tore through the empty lot. The gas nozzle fell onto the concrete. Naomi's back slid down the side of the car as she twisted her body, turning toward the side where her baby wasn't. The officer remained standing there with his gun still raised. Then he reached up to his chest and switched off his camera, completely unaware that behind him, a man had just stepped out of the shadows. A man whose name made people across 3 counties lower their voices whenever they spoke it. What that officer didn't know was that the man hadn't come there by chance, that he was looking for something inside that cloth bag, and that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life in front of the one witness who couldn't be bought, couldn't be threatened, and never forgot. If this story of courage, dignity, and justice moves you, please press the like button. Share it with someone who still believes ordinary people deserve to be heard, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories like this one. Now let us return to that August afternoon, to $12 worth of gas, and to the 4 minutes that changed everything. That August afternoon began before dawn, when Naomi Sinclair finished her night shift at Riverbend Nursing Home and, instead of walking out to the parking lot, circled back to the manager's office to ask for the morning shift as well. The manager looked at her pregnant belly, then at the schedule on the wall, sighed, and wrote her name in the empty space. She thanked him twice and turned away, because she'd learned that people were more likely to change their minds if she lingered too long. She washed her face with cold water in the staff restroom, tied back her hair, and began her second shift as though the first had never existed. The first room she entered belonged to Mrs. Rosalind, an 84-year-old woman whose memory had departed long ago, leaving behind only a small, fragile figure sitting on the edge of the bed, unable to recognize anyone who walked through the door. She didn't remember her son's name. She didn't remember which city she was in. But every time Naomi entered, she looked up and said, "There you are," as though a thread existed between them that illness couldn't cut. Naomi washed her with warm cloths, brushed her hair, and when she helped her lie down, she began to sing softly. It was an old song no one at the nursing home knew by name, a song Naomi's foster mother had once sung in a cramped kitchen on the city's east side when Naomi was still young and didn't understand why she kept being moved from one home to another. She didn't sing for anyone to hear. She sang because it was the only way she knew to tell someone they hadn't been abandoned. Mrs. Rosalind fell asleep before the song ended, and Naomi remained there for another moment, one hand supporting her lower back and the other resting on her belly, feeling the baby move beneath her palm like a reminder that she still had to keep going. When her break came, she went to her locker, turned the combination lock whose markings had been worn away, and opened the thin metal door. There were only 3 things inside. A wedding photograph taken outside City Hall, in which she was smiling while Andre looked at her instead of the camera. A notice terminating her lease, folded into quarters and read so many times that the creases had begun to tear. And an old phone with a diagonal crack across the screen that had belonged to her late husband. She picked up the phone, checked that it still had power, then placed it inside the cloth bag she carried everywhere, even when she slept. Even when she went into the bathroom. No one at Riverbend understood why she guarded it so carefully, and she'd never explained it to anyone. A coworker passing by saw her leaning against the locker to catch her breath, and asked why she still hadn't taken maternity leave. Naomi smiled, the kind of smile exhausted people still tried to give others, then answered that if she stopped working, What would she use to pay for the room her little girl would come home to? Her coworker fell silent, because there was no answer to a question like that. When her shift ended, Naomi went to her car, sat behind the wheel, and before starting the engine, took a stamped envelope from her bag. She didn't drive directly toward the highway. She turned into the post office on the corner, waited in line behind two people, then placed the letter on the counter. The clerk looked at the recipient's address, the State Department of Labor, then at her, and asked how many letters she'd sent. Naomi looked down at the envelope in the clerk's hand for a long time, then said she didn't count anymore. She said it calmly, without bitterness or resentment, in the voice of someone who had stopped expecting but hadn't stopped trying. After leaving the post office, she remained inside her car beneath the stifling early afternoon sun, unlocked the old phone, found the short recording she'd listened to more times than she could remember, and pressed play. Andre's voice filled the car, only for a few seconds. An ordinary sentence from an ordinary morning. Something he'd recorded hurriedly before walking out the door without knowing it would be the last time. Naomi listened to the entire recording without rewinding or stopping halfway through. Then she turned off the screen, returned the phone to the cloth bag, pulled the zipper closed, and placed the bag on the passenger seat beside her. She looked at the gas gauge touching the red line, opened her wallet to count the money she had left, then started the engine and drove toward the highway. That same afternoon, a 40-minute drive away, Elias Rourke stood alone before a grave in a cemetery south of the city and said nothing for nearly half an hour. He came there once a month, always in the early afternoon when the cemetery was empty, and always stood in exactly the same place with his hands at his sides, his charcoal gray suit without a wrinkle beneath the August sun. His mother's name, Maeve Rourke, was carved into the headstone, and beneath it was a short line he'd chosen himself, but had never read aloud. He brought no flowers. His mother hadn't liked flowers. She'd once said flowers were something people brought so they could feel they'd done something. When he turned to leave, the black sedan was already waiting on the gravel drive, and Wes Halloran stood beside the rear door, opening it for him without a word, because Wes had served this family long enough to know when silence was required. The car began moving, and only after the cemetery gates had disappeared behind them did Wes place a thin envelope on the seat beside him. Elias didn't open it immediately. He looked through the window for a while, before picking it up, removing several sheets of paper, and reading them. Wes summarized the matter in 4 brief sentences, exactly as he'd learned to do, saying that someone in the warehouse operations had been taking money from the fund for several months, that the books had been altered carelessly, that the person had worked for the Rourke family since his father's time, and that he was currently at home without any idea he'd been discovered. Elias read everything, folded the pages along their original creases, then returned them to the envelope. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't strike the seat with his hand. He didn't ask why, how much, or who else was involved. He merely looked through the window at the rows of trees moving backward along the road and told Wes that the man had 4 hours. Wes waited for the rest of the sentence, the part every other boss would have spoken, the part explaining what would happen after those 4 hours. But Elias said nothing. He simply handed back the envelope, and Wes accepted it, and the car fell silent for several seconds. The silence of someone who had just understood that the most frightening thing wasn't a threat, but the empty space where a threat should have been. The man left the city within 3 hours. No one went to his house. No one called him. There was only one telephone call from an old acquaintance saying that the boss knew, and that was enough to make him stuff his clothes into a gym bag, wake his wife from her afternoon sleep, and drive beyond the county line before the sun sank low. In all the years Elias had spent running what his family ran, he'd never needed to say anything twice to anyone. It was the kind of power that required no proof, and the fact that it needed no proof was what made it so frightening. After the car had traveled a little farther, Elias spoke again, his voice as quiet as before, saying he wanted the final 2 operations shut down that month. Wes turned completely around from the front seat, and for the first time that day, he failed to maintain his composure. He said Elias's father had spent his entire life building those 2 operations. He said the men below them were growing anxious, that the Kessler family had begun asking questions around the western yards, and that when a man began loosening his grip, others would interpret it as an invitation. He said all of it in the voice of a loyal man who was genuinely afraid, not someone trying to claim a larger share for himself. Elias listened without interrupting once. Then he turned toward Wes and said he didn't need Wes to understand. He needed Wes to do it. Wes sat in silence for a moment, then nodded, and faced forward again, both hands clasped tightly in his lap. No one in the car spoke for the remainder of the drive. The The fuel gauge gradually sank lower, and the driver asked whether they should stop somewhere. Elias looked at the signs along the road and saw an old gas station beside the next turn, a place he'd passed more times than he could remember without ever stopping. With a faded canopy and an abandoned car wash tucked into the far corner, he said they could stop there. The black sedan slowed, activated its turn signal, and pulled into Halstead gas station on that August afternoon. Inside the convenience store at Halstead gas station, Delia Marsh was wiping down the glass refrigerator doors when she saw the patrol car pull in and block the exit. She was 24 years old, had been working the afternoon shift there for more than a year, and she had learned how to recognize the moment when something was about to turn bad. She knew that officer. Everyone in Cedar Hollow knew Wade Pruitt, knew the way he only stopped cars that were too old and people wearing work clothes from their shifts, knew that he had never once pulled over a newer car on this stretch of road. Delia looked through 2 layers of glass, saw the woman in the nursing assistant uniform raise both hands, and saw Pruitt take another step closer. She set down the cleaning cloth. She didn't run outside. She didn't call anyone. She simply took her phone from the pocket of her apron, lowered her hand to hip level so no one outside could see it, and started recording. Later, she wouldn't be able to explain why she had done it. She would only say that sometimes there is a voice inside you telling you that whatever is about to happen needs someone to witness it. Outside in the lot, everything unfolded faster than Delia could understand. Pruitt ordered Naomi to produce her identification. Then only seconds later, just as she shifted forward, he shouted at her to stand still and not move. The 2 commands collided, the second erasing the first, and between them was a space no one could enter without being wrong. Naomi stopped. She repeated that she would reach for her identification very slowly, that it was inside the car, and that she would announce every movement before making it. But when she leaned across the driver's seat, her hand didn't move toward the wallet in the door compartment. It moved toward the cloth bag on the passenger seat, the bag she'd carried throughout that day and all the months before it, the thing she touched instinctively whenever she was afraid. It was a very small, very human movement, and Pruitt saw the bag shift. About 100 feet away, beneath the canopy of the abandoned car wash, Elias Rourke stood beside the black sedan and watched those 4 minutes unfold before him. He didn't intervene because until the final second, he still believed he was watching an ordinary event in America. Then the blast echoed against the car wash's metal siding, and everything changed direction. Elias was the first person to run toward her. Not Pruitt, who was standing much closer. Not Delia, who still held the trembling phone behind the glass. He raced across the scorching concrete, pulled off his suit jacket while still several steps away, and dropped to his knees beside the woman leaning against the side of her car. He folded the jacket, placed it over her shoulder, and pressed down with his full weight. The tailored suit cost more than the car she was resting against, and he didn't think about that for even a second. Naomi opened her eyes. Her pupils widened, then narrowed again, struggling to find the face bending over her. Only then did Pruitt rush forward, his voice breaking with panic, as he shouted for Elias to step away, shouted that this was a crime scene, and he wasn't allowed to touch anything. Elias didn't rise. He didn't release the pressure. He merely lifted his head, looked directly into the officer's face, and asked so quietly that Pruitt had to lean closer to hear whether he knew whom he was speaking to. There was no threat in the question. No name had been spoken. But Pruitt looked into those eyes, saw the calmness within them without the slightest trace of fear, and something in his stomach turned cold. He stepped backward. Then he took another step. Naomi's lips moved faintly. Elias bent lower to hear her. She didn't ask him to save her. She didn't ask whether she would live. She only whispered that she was pregnant, and begged him to save her baby first, to save her little girl first. Then her hand loosened from the front of his shirt. Elias drew out his phone with his free hand, but he didn't call emergency services. He made 2 calls in succession. The first was to the family's private physician, who would reach the hospital before the ambulance and would know whom to speak with. The second was to Miriam Blackwood, who had served as the Rourke family's attorney for more than 20 years, and he gave her only one instruction: to come to Halstead gas station on the highway immediately, and not call anyone while she was on her way. Then he placed the phone on the concrete beside him, set both hands over the charcoal gray jacket that was growing darker by the moment, and pressed harder. The ambulance arrived after an amount of time that no one would later agree upon, and 2 paramedics jumped out with a wheeled stretcher before them. They had to tell Elias to release his hands a second time before he finally stood, and when he stepped back, both knees of his trousers were covered in concrete dust, while his suit jacket remained on the ground. abandoned like something no one needed anymore. They lifted Naomi onto the stretcher, secured her, and pushed her into the ambulance. The doors slammed shut. Inside, the overhead lights were harsh and white, entirely different from the golden sunlight outside, and Naomi drifted between consciousness and darkness, like someone carried toward shore by a wave, and then pulled back out again. She heard the siren echoing through the walls of the ambulance. She heard someone calling out numbers she didn't understand. Then she saw the paramedic beside her take out a small recorder, press a button, and begin speaking into it in a quick, even voice, reading her vital signs according to the same procedure he followed on every shift. Naomi looked at the recorder. There were no clear thoughts left in her mind, only one final instinct, the instinct of someone who had lived low enough for long enough to know what would be written after she was no longer able to speak. She gathered every fragment of strength she had left, turned her face toward the recorder, and spoke. She said her name was Naomi Sinclair. She said she hadn't resisted. She said her hands had been raised. The paramedic bent closer and told her to be quiet, told her not to speak anymore, to preserve her strength and not waste her breath. But she repeated it again, more slowly now, the words more broken, one at a time. Her name, she hadn't resisted. Her hands had been raised. Then she stopped. Her eyes closed, her head tilted to one side, and the paramedic turned toward his partner and called out the name of a medication. The small recorder remained where it was, its indicator light still glowing, and no one inside the ambulance gave it another thought. Outside in the gas station lot, everything had already begun to be arranged into order. Sean Brody was the last to arrive, a 26-year-old rookie officer assigned to the Northern District, who had heard the call over the radio. And when he stepped from his cruiser, the first thing he saw was the charcoal gray suit jacket lying on the concrete beside a puddle of wash water. He asked Pruitt what had happened. Pruitt answered immediately without needing to think, and that was what struck Brody as strange, though at the time, he couldn't yet give the feeling a name. Pruitt said the woman had resisted, that she hadn't followed his commands, that she'd reached beneath the seat toward something, and that he'd feared for his life. He delivered those sentences in that exact order, smoothly and without stumbling, like a man reciting something he'd memorized beforehand, rather than describing something he'd just lived through. Brody looked toward the black sedan parked beside the abandoned car wash, where a man in a white shirt stood speaking on the telephone, and he was about to ask another question when the police chief's vehicle pulled in. Marlon Gage stepped out, 56 years old, with more than 20 years in law enforcement, and more than 10 years in the highest office in Cedar Hollow. He walked once around Naomi's old car, looked down at the concrete, then toward the highway where the ambulance had just disappeared. Brody waited for the question he believed anyone would ask first, whether the woman was still alive and where she'd been taken. But Gage didn't ask that. He turned toward Pruitt, lowered his voice, and asked whether anyone had recorded it. Brody heard every word, and he felt something inside his chest sink. Pruitt shook his head and said there was only the girl behind the counter, that she hadn't seen anything, that the store was too far away and there were 2 layers of glass between them. Gage nodded, then told Pruitt to retrieve the gas station's security footage, saying word for word that it was evidence and needed to be taken to the department immediately for preservation. He said it in the voice of a man following proper procedure, and no one standing there had enough authority to question him. Brody watched Pruitt walk toward the convenience store, watched Delia Marsh standing behind the glass with both hands resting flat on the counter, and said nothing. Later, he would always remember that this was the first moment he chose silence, and how frighteningly easy that choice had been. Pruitt entered the convenience store and told Delia Marsh that he needed the gas station's security footage, that it was evidence in an incident under investigation. Delia said she had to call the station owner first. Pruitt said she could make the call, but he was taking the recorder now. He walked behind the counter, opened the small electrical cabinet beneath it, disconnected the wires, and carried the metal box outside under her gaze without signing a single document. The entire process took less than 2 minutes, and throughout those 2 minutes, Delia stood perfectly still with her right hand inside her apron pocket, gripping her phone so tightly that she didn't notice the imprint in her palm until later. Outside, Wes Halloran saw Pruitt emerge with the metal box in his hands, and something switched on inside his mind. He didn't think about justice. He didn't think about the woman who had just been taken away. He thought about the first thing he'd always considered throughout the decades he'd spent serving this family, that his boss had just been seen at a scene the police were preparing to rewrite however they pleased. Wes turned and walked quickly toward the black sedan, and when he was still several steps away, he nearly broke into a run. He opened the left rear door, reached beneath the seat, and searched for the plastic cover he'd personally ordered installed many years earlier. After the night in the parking lot beside the river, the night Elias had nearly failed to return home, and Wes had sworn to his mother that it would never happen again, he'd installed a recording system around the car, 4 cameras with microphones, running continuously and overwriting itself every half hour. It wasn't intended to collect evidence. It existed so that if something happened, his people would know which direction the car had last traveled. Elias had even forgotten the system was still operating, but Wes hadn't. And now he was counting backward inside his mind, from the blast to the ambulance's arrival, from the ambulance's arrival to the moment Gage stepped out of his vehicle, and from that moment to now, the number was moving rapidly toward the point after which those 4 minutes in the gas station lot would be erased by the system itself and could never be recovered. His fingernails slipped along the edge of the plastic cover. He swore very quietly, used the car key to pry into the seam, and the panel sprang loose. He pulled out the hard drive, a small metal block the size of a pack of cigarettes, still warm, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, just as a third patrol car entered the lot. He closed the car door, straightened, adjusted his collar, and walked away like a man who had merely retrieved a bottle of water. No one was looking toward him. Elias stood nearby with the sleeves of his white shirt rolled to his elbows, both hands hastily rinsed beneath the faucet at the car wash, and he saw everything. He watched Wes approach, saw the way he lightly touched the front of his coat, and understood. Wes stopped beside him and said very quietly that he'd recovered it, that it had nearly been erased, that only a little more time and there would have been nothing left. Elias didn't answer. He looked toward the highway, where the final siren had faded long ago, then down at the charcoal gray suit jacket still lying on the concrete, which no one had bothered to pick up. Wes waited. Then he asked the question he'd been waiting to ask since the gunshot was still ringing in his ears, a question spoken in a language they both understood without explanation. Handle it now? Only 3 words. He asked in the calm voice of a man who had done this many times and knew exactly how many people, how many hours, and how much money it would require. Elias remained silent longer than Wes expected. Then he said no. He said this time they would do it by the law. Wes turned sharply toward him, ready to object, ready to say that the law in that county belonged to the men standing outside, that bringing the truth into the light wouldn't bring the dead back, while the man who fired the shot would still report for work on Monday morning. But Elias had already turned and looked directly into his eyes, and he continued in the same quiet voice he'd used in the car that afternoon when speaking of 4 hours, saying that he would follow the law, but he would make the law walk straight. Dr. Ada Okonjo was waiting in the county hospital's emergency department before the ambulance arrived, because the Rourke family's private physician had called her on the way and said only one thing, that a pregnant woman was being brought in, and Ada needed to be waiting at the door. She was 50 years old, and had delivered babies in that county longer than Wade Pruitt had worn a uniform, and she didn't ask who had summoned her, or why. She merely looked at the woman on the stretcher, saw the belly carrying a 7-month pregnancy, and began giving orders. Naomi Sinclair's daughter was born earlier than expected late that August afternoon, inside an operating room, while Naomi was completely unconscious. The baby was taken to the neonatal unit, and the nurses took turns caring for her throughout the night, cleaning her, keeping her warm, and stopping to look at her whenever they passed. She breathed steadily. She slept peacefully. An older nurse named Bernice remained beside her longer than her duties required, and when someone asked why, she said only that the little girl didn't have anyone yet, so she would sit with her a while longer. Meanwhile, downstairs, the hospital's administrative office was facing a problem it had never encountered in quite this way. There was a stack of documents requiring a relative's signature, consent forms for procedures, admission papers, a temporary birth record, forms determining who could visit and who should be notified. An administrator called the emergency contact number listed in Naomi's records at Riverbend Nursing Home, and it rang on a phone whose service had been disconnected months earlier, the phone belonging to Andre Sinclair. They searched for other relatives. There were no parents, no siblings, no guardian from her childhood, no one among the foster families who had once taken her in and later sent her away. The administrator sat before the computer and realized that the woman lying upstairs didn't have a single person in the world they could call. Elias Rourke had been sitting in the hallway since daylight still filled the windows. He was still wearing the same white shirt, and no one said anything to him about it. When the administrator came out carrying the stack of documents and hesitantly asked whether he was a relative, Elias stood and said he wasn't. The administrator explained that they still needed a signature, that some things couldn't wait, that without anyone to sign, the file would have to enter a different process, and everything would be delayed considerably. Elias took the pen. He signed every page slowly and clearly with his full name, without abbreviating anything. Then he reached the final page, where a small box contained faint printed words asking his relationship to the patient. He stopped there. He remained still for so long that the administrator became uncomfortable and looked away. He wasn't her husband. He wasn't her friend. He hadn't even known her name until he heard someone say it inside the emergency room. But he wasn't a stranger either. Not after those 4 minutes. Not after his 2 hands had held her on the scorching concrete. At last, he bent down and wrote 3 words in the box: witness to incident, then set down the pen and returned the documents. Less than an hour later, as the shifts changed, a supervising nurse carried the file while searching for a room for the new patient, and told a colleague that this case had no insurance, no guarantor, and had also been flagged by the police as part of an investigation. So under normal procedure, placement in the East Wing made the most sense. Elias heard those words from his chair in the hallway. He stood, walked to the window at the far end of the corridor, took out his phone, and made one call. The call was brief, shorter than the time needed to make a cup of coffee, and no one heard what he said. Then he returned to his seat. About half an hour later, a man in a suit stepped out of the elevator, spoke with the night administrators, and everything quietly changed direction. Naomi Sinclair was transferred to a private room on the 7th floor, with a window overlooking the parking lot and an armchair beside the bed. Outside her door, 2 men in plain clothes arrived, sat down in 2 chairs, and remained there from that day forward. They wore no uniforms. They displayed no badges. They simply sat. No one explained to the nurses why the men were there, and the nurses exchanged glances and let the matter rest. Because there were moments in life when people understood that their questions wouldn't be answered, and it was better not to ask. Naomi woke on a morning without knowing how many mornings had passed. The ceiling was white, the light was soft, a heart monitor sounded steadily somewhere to her left, and a dull pain ran from her shoulder down along her ribs. She lay still for several seconds, trying to understand where she was. Then her hand moved to her belly. It was flat. She sat up so quickly that the entire room tilted, and the first sound from her mouth wasn't a cry of pain, but a question. She asked where her baby was. She asked whether her baby was still alive. A nurse rushed in, placed one hand on Naomi's uninjured shoulder, and told her the baby was all right, that she'd arrived earlier than expected, but was all right, that she was sleeping peacefully in the neonatal unit, and the nurses there had taken turns caring for her over the past several days. Naomi listened until the nurse had finished before she exhaled, and when she did, her entire body collapsed like a rope that had just been cut. She said she wanted to see her baby. She said she wanted to see her now. They told her she was still weak and should remain in bed. But she repeated the same sentence until someone went to bring a wheelchair. They helped her into it, placed a pillow behind her back, and that was when the sleeve of her gown slipped upward. A steel handcuff encircled her left wrist, its other end secured to the metal frame of the wheelchair. She stared at the cold metal for a long moment, but said nothing as they pushed her out of the room. At the doorway, the 2 men in plain clothes rose from their chairs and followed several steps behind without speaking. The 7th floor hallway was long and quiet. The elevator descended 2 floors. Then the doors to the neonatal unit opened, and Naomi saw her daughter for the first time. The baby lay on her side, with both hands loosely curled near her face, her chest rising and falling steadily beneath a white swaddling blanket. She was smaller than Naomi had imagined, and more peaceful than Naomi had dared to hope. They wouldn't allow her to hold the baby yet. They only lowered the shield and showed her the small opening in the side. Naomi slowly reached through with her uninjured hand and touched one finger to her daughter's palm. The baby grasped it. Those tiny fingers closed around her mother's finger with far more strength than their appearance suggested and held on. Naomi sat motionless. She didn't cry. She'd cried enough during the previous months, in parking lots, in the staff restroom, while driving home alone in the middle of the night, and now there were no tears left inside her for this moment. She merely bent lower, brought her face close to the opening, and spoke to her daughter in the same soft voice she used when singing Mrs. Rosalind to sleep. She said, "Mommy is here now," she said. "I'm sorry I came late." Then she told her daughter that she hadn't done anything wrong, that the little girl had to believe her, that no matter what anyone said in the years ahead, she needed to remember that for her mother. The baby continued holding her finger. Beyond the glass, a nurse turned her face away. When Naomi withdrew her hand, she felt the heavy pull of the steel chain against the wheelchair frame. She looked at the handcuff, then through the opening at her sleeping daughter, then back at the handcuff. No one in the hallway said a word. They wheeled her back to the 7th floor, helped her into bed, and locked the other end of the cuff to the bed rail. That afternoon, a nurse came in to change her intravenous fluids and casually turned on the television, mounted on the wall so the room wouldn't feel so empty, then left again. A local news report was playing, and in the middle of it appeared an image of Naomi's old car parked beside a pump at Halstead gas station. The anchor said a Cedar Hollow police officer had been forced to open fire during a tense encounter, that a female subject had resisted law enforcement, and that the incident was being investigated according to established procedure. Then the words scrolling across the bottom of the screen displayed her name. They had written it incorrectly. They wrote Naomi Sinclair, with an extra letter at the end, the name of someone who wasn't her. Naomi watched the words travel from right to left before disappearing. She lay still. Her right hand rested on her belly, where her little girl had been only days earlier. Her left hand lay open on the white sheet, and the steel handcuff lightly touched the bed rail with every breath she took. Elias was still sitting in the 7th floor hallway that afternoon, about 20 paces from her door, on a row of plastic chairs intended for patients' relatives, where he'd spent more hours than he cared to admit. He didn't go inside. He'd never gone inside. He simply sat there with his phone face down on his lap, and every time the door opened, he looked up, then lowered his eyes again. His 2 men remained in the chairs outside her room, silent as pieces of furniture. Then 2 nurses passed Elias, speaking to each other in the quiet voices people used inside hospitals. And one of them said the patient in room 702 was the young woman who worked at Riverbend, the nursing home out on Milton Road, that her name was Naomi, and that the nurse's cousin had once worked there too. The other nurse asked which Riverbend she meant. The first said the Riverbend with the end-of-life care unit in the rear wing, the place where people had been sending elderly patients during their final stages for the past several years. Then they disappeared into the elevator. Elias remained still. Something had just turned inside his mind, slowly and heavily, like a door that hadn't been opened in years. Riverbend, the rear wing, the end-of-life care unit. He'd walked through that hallway every evening for weeks during his mother's final winter, and he remembered its smell clearly. Floor cleaner mingled with the scent of the artificial flowers arranged at the nurse's station. He remembered that he always arrived late. He remembered always standing in the hallway, with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking to one person after another about things he could no longer remember. And he remembered the singing. On certain evenings, when he ended his call and approached his mother's door, he heard a song drifting softly from inside, a young woman's voice singing an old melody whose name he didn't know. He would stop outside the door and wait for the song to end before entering, because he didn't want to interrupt. It happened every time. And every time, a young woman emerged wearing blue scrubs, nodded to him, then continued toward the far end of the hallway, and he never asked her name. His mother, however, spoke about her constantly. She didn't remember the young woman's name, or perhaps she'd never asked, so she called her by a name of her own invention. She said the girl with the singing voice had stayed past the end of her shift again. She said the poor child wasn't paid $1 extra for nights like those. She said the girl sang terribly, then laughed, the laughter of someone preparing to leave who still wanted the person remaining behind to feel lighter. On the final night, the night Elias arrived later than usual, because of a meeting at the yards whose subject he'd completely forgotten, he entered the room and found his mother asleep while the young woman sat in the chair beside the bed, one hand resting over hers as she sang the final line. When she saw him, she stood and said his mother had only just fallen asleep, then walked out. He'd intended to thank her. He remembered clearly that he'd meant to say it, but at that moment, his phone vibrated inside his pocket, and he reached for it, and by the time he looked up again, the hallway was empty. Elias sat on the plastic chair on the 7th floor and looked down at his hands. Beneath his fingernails remained a dark stain he hadn't been able to scrub away beneath the car wash faucet that day. These were the same hands that had pressed against a woman's shoulder on the scorching concrete only days earlier, and he'd done it for a stranger, someone he believed he'd never met in his life. But he had met her. He'd passed her more times than he could count, had stood only one wooden door away from her during the final nights of his mother's life. And through all those encounters, he'd never once asked her name. He was the man whose name made people across 3 counties lower their voices. Yet he hadn't known the name of the woman who stayed beyond her shift to sing his mother to sleep. He remained in that chair for a long time. Then he stood, walked to the window at the end of the hallway, and looked down at the parking lot until darkness had completely fallen. When he returned, he didn't sit again. He told his men that from then on, if anyone asked, they were to say he was family. The following evening, inside the study of the large house south of the city, 3 people sat around the wooden table where Elias's father had once sat, and his grandfather before him. The small hard drive rested in the center of the table, untouched by anyone. Wes Halloran spoke first. He spoke like a man who had calculated every step before entering the room, saying the matter could be finished within a week, that the county was small, that the records would say accident or departure from the state, that no one had ever traced anything back to this family in 3 generations, and no one would trace this back to them either. He said that if they waited too long, everything would begin to rot, recordings would disappear, people would change their statements, and in the end, she would be the one who lost. Then he added something he'd been holding inside for several days. He said the Kessler family had begun sending people to ask questions around the western yards, that they'd seen 2 operations shut down and interpreted it in their own way. That in this world, when a man released his grip, no one thought it was conscience. They thought it was weakness. He said that if Elias became involved in a matter with the police now, by winter, the Western Territory would no longer bear the Rourke name. Elias listened without interrupting. Then he turned toward Miriam Blackwood. She'd served as the family's attorney since before he knew how to shave, and she was the only person in the room who had never needed to lower her voice when speaking to him. She said the second path was far shorter. She said the matter couldn't be handled at the county level, because the county was where it had been born. It had to go federal, through a civil rights case, and she gave him the name Camille Ashford, a federal prosecutor whose record she'd followed for years, and whom she knew couldn't be bought. Then she placed one hand on the table beside the hard drive and told him the rest. She said that if he surrendered it, he would have to testify that he'd been there. If he testified that he'd been there, they would ask where he'd been coming from. If he answered, they would open his records. And once those records were open, they wouldn't stop with him. They would follow them backward to his father, and to things buried before Elias had even been born. She said there was no way for him to save the woman and preserve himself. He had to choose. The room remained silent for a long time. Wes looked at Elias, and within that look was everything he didn't say. That this was his mother's house, that she'd told Wes to preserve it. Elias rose, walked to the window, and stood there with his back to both of them. Then he spoke in the quiet voice that everyone in the room had learned to fear. He said that if the man died, everything would stop exactly where it stood now. The report on television would never be corrected. People would write that the suspect had resisted, that the police officer had died mysteriously, and then those 2 things would remain beside each other in the file forever, and she would carry the word suspect with her until the day her daughter was old enough to search for her mother's name. He turned toward Wes. He said he didn't need that man dead. He needed her name restored. Elias didn't return to his room that night. The following morning, he drove to a row of boarding houses on the edge of Cedar Hollow, parked some distance away, and walked to the door. Delia Marsh opened it only slightly, leaving the chain fastened, and when she recognized him, her face went white. She said she didn't know anything. She said she'd already spoken to the police, that she'd been cleaning the refrigerator and hadn't looked outside. She said she worked the afternoon shift for only a few dollars an hour, that she was supporting her mother, that she had no attorney and nothing to protect her. Elias didn't enter. He remained on the front step, with both hands in his trouser pockets, and he said nothing about money or what would happen if she remained silent. He asked only one question, whether, if the woman standing beside the gas pump that day had been her mother, she would have wanted someone to speak. Delia stood motionless behind the partly open door for a long time. Then she removed the chain. Miriam Blackwood came to the 7th floor one morning early in the week, introduced herself through the partly open door, and sat in the armchair beside the bed where no one had ever sat. She said she was an attorney, that she'd come because someone had asked her to, and that if Naomi wanted her to leave, she would go immediately. Naomi studied her for a long time, then told her she could stay. The handcuff was still there, secured to the bed rail, and Miriam saw it but said nothing about it. She asked Naomi what she remembered. Naomi began at the beginning and told her everything slowly, omitting no detail, while Miriam wrote in her notebook. But near the end, Naomi stopped, and Miriam realized she was thinking about something else. Naomi said she wanted to ask a question. She wanted to know whether the police kept a record every time an officer searched someone's license plate in the system. Miriam put down her pen and said yes. Every search left a record, including the time and the identification number of the officer who performed it, and she could request that record. Naomi told her to request it. Miriam asked what she was thinking. Naomi said she didn't know yet. She only wanted to see. The record arrived at the end of the week, 3 sheets of paper printed in blurred ink, and Miriam handed them to her, then sat quietly while she read. Naomi read very slowly, because she had only one uninjured hand, and because the pages were filled with codes she didn't understand. But she understood the date column. She understood the time column. And she understood the final 4 numbers of her license plate. The plate she'd seen every day throughout the years that Carr had carried her to work. It appeared there. Not once. It appeared multiple times during the 10 days before that August afternoon. And every search had occurred at hours when an ordinary patrol officer would have been home long before. Hours when the record clearly stated that the person conducting the search wasn't on duty. Naomi read it a second time, then a third. Then she lowered the pages onto the blanket and looked out the window, while inside her mind, something began arranging itself slowly, like fragments finding their proper places. She remembered that afternoon. She remembered that the patrol car hadn't sounded its siren or activated its lights from a distance. It had pulled directly across the exit, as though the officer already knew where he intended to stop. She remembered that he hadn't asked whether she was all right, or whether something was wrong with her car. He'd asked her name before requesting her identification. Throughout the weeks she'd spent in the hospital, she'd believed this was simply something that happened to people like her in places like that. Some random, terrible thing that had fallen upon her. But no one searched a stranger's license plate multiple times in the middle of the night. People did that only when they were looking. He hadn't encountered her. He'd gone looking for her. Naomi lay still with that thought for a long time. Then the next question came, colder than the first. What had he been looking for? She owed no one. She wasn't involved in anything. She worked 2 shifts a day and went home to sleep. There was nothing in her life worth an armed man watching for 10 days. She thought about everyone she'd ever argued with, and there was no one. She thought about every document she'd ever signed, and there was nothing. Then she thought about the one thing she'd guarded closely throughout the previous months, the thing she carried even when she slept, the thing she'd placed on the passenger seat beside her that afternoon, and she remembered precisely what she'd done in the moment before the blast. She hadn't reached toward the wallet in the door compartment. She'd reached toward the cloth bag. Naomi sat up so quickly that pain tore through the wound in her shoulder, and she asked Miriam where her belongings were, where her cloth bag was. Miriam said the hospital was holding them and would return them when Naomi was discharged. Naomi told her to retrieve the bag immediately. Miriam asked what was inside it. Naomi looked at her, and for the first time since waking, her voice was no longer level. She said it contained her husband's phone. She said she'd spent months sending complaint after complaint to the State Department of Labor, and everything she'd written in those complaints was based on what was stored inside that phone. Then she spoke the final words very quietly. He hadn't been looking for her. He'd been looking for the phone. Miriam brought the cloth bag upstairs the following afternoon, and Naomi opened it on top of the blanket, removed the phone with the cracked screen from beneath the fabric lining, and turned it on. Everything was still there. Everything Andre had photographed during the final week of his life. Pictures Naomi had studied so often that she knew every corner by heart, and the message he'd sent his supervisor 2 days before he fell. She showed them to Miriam, who sat in silence for a long time. Then Miriam asked where she'd sent this material. Naomi said she'd sent it to the State Department of Labor. Miriam asked how many times. Naomi said she no longer counted, but many times. So many times. Every month, and during some months, twice. Miriam asked how they had responded. Naomi said they hadn't. Not once. Not one piece of paper. Miriam closed her notebook and said she needed to make a trip. She was gone for 3 days. She didn't tell Naomi where she was going, and Naomi didn't ask because she was accustomed to people not returning. But Miriam came back. She entered the room one morning without removing her coat, placed her briefcase on the chair, and said she'd discovered what had happened to Naomi's letters. Naomi sat straighter. Miriam explained it briefly. She said there was a man in the department's records room who had worked there for many years, a perfectly ordinary man whom his colleagues described as gentle and fond of bringing pastries on Fridays. She said that every month, a small payment entered his account from a service company that, if traced backward, led to a familiar name. She said his task was simple. So simple that no one had noticed it throughout all those years. He only had to stand at the first stage, where mail from across the state arrived and was sorted before being entered into the records, and remove any envelope mentioning one particular name. Naomi asked which name. Miriam said Holloway. Naomi said nothing. Miriam continued, saying the envelopes hadn't been destroyed. They'd been kept inside the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet in the corner of the room, a drawer everyone believed contained office supplies. She said she'd gone there the previous morning with Ashford's people, and they had opened it. Naomi asked how many of her letters were inside. Miriam was silent for 1 beat before answering, a pause Naomi would remember for the rest of her life. She said it wasn't only Naomi's letters. She said the drawer was heavy when they pulled it open, so heavy that the person opening it needed both hands. Inside were letters standing upright, packed tightly from one end to the other. And when they began removing them, it took 2 cardboard boxes to hold them all. She said there were letters from many people, bearing different names and different handwriting. Some were typed, some handwritten, and some written on graph paper torn from school notebooks. Some envelopes had edges yellowed with age. The oldest they found bore a postmark from nearly a decade earlier. Naomi looked at her, and for a long time, she couldn't speak. Then she asked in a hoarse voice whether that meant no one had ever read her letters. Miriam said yes. Naomi asked again, more slowly, as though she needed to hear it once more before she could believe it, whether throughout all those months, not one person in that building had ever opened one of her envelopes. Miriam gently shook her head. She said the clerk had opened them just to scan for Holloway's name and report the evidence she mentioned, then buried them in the drawer. No one had ever read them to help her. And that was when Naomi cried for the first time since waking. She hadn't cried when she saw the handcuff. She hadn't cried when she saw her name misspelled across the television screen, but she cried now, raising her uninjured hand to cover her face as her shoulders trembled, and the sobs came out choked and ugly, the cries of someone who had held them back for far too long. Because throughout those months, she'd told herself people were busy, that her letters were waiting in line somewhere, that when her turn came, someone would read them. She'd sat in her car outside the post office and told herself that this time would be different. She'd gotten up to work another shift after already completing the first, so she would have money to buy stamps. She'd believed the system was slow, not closed, and she'd been wrong. When she lowered her hand from her face, she spoke only one sentence, not to Miriam, but to the empty space before her. She said she'd believed no one cared enough to answer her, when the truth was that no one had ever read what she wrote. Inside the 2 cardboard boxes removed from that drawer, Miriam's people found 3 letters that stood out from all the others. 3 letters written by 3 people who had once worked for Holloway and had filed complaints about the same thing Andre Sinclair had photographed. One was a man who had worked on scaffolding and had since moved to another state. One was a woman who had worked in the materials department, and one was a retired electrician who lived less than half an hour from Cedar Hollow. Miriam met with all 3, and each told her the same story, with details so similar that she had to check whether they knew one another. They didn't. None of the 3 had been assaulted. No one had threatened them aloud. What happened was simply that not long after they mailed their letters, a patrol car appeared outside their home one evening. The police officer stepped out, knocked on the door, and politely asked how they were doing. He asked where their children attended school. He said there had been several burglaries in the neighborhood recently, so he was making his rounds to ensure everyone was safe. Then he remained on the front steps a little longer, looked inside the house, and said it was a beautiful home, and that keeping it that way couldn't be easy. Then he said goodnight and left. That was all. The retired electrician told Miriam he couldn't explain to anyone why he'd been afraid, because when he described it, nothing had happened. A police officer had asked a few questions and gone away, but he hadn't slept that night. And 3 days later, someone from the county police union called, speaking in a warm, reasonable voice, saying that if this matter continued, it would become exhausting for both sides, that a small assistance payment was available for him. Not much, but enough to repair the roof. And all he had to do was sign a document stating that he withdrew his complaint and wouldn't mention the matter again. All 3 had signed. The woman from the materials department told Miriam she'd held the paper and sat at her kitchen table until nearly dawn before putting pen to it. And for all the years afterward, whenever she passed the work site, she looked the other way. The name that had signed and arranged every settlement was always the same: Hal Devereaux, president of the county police union. Elias went to see him one afternoon at the same diner where Devereaux sat every Wednesday, and took the chair opposite him without asking permission. Devereaux was 61 years old, had occupied that chair for more than half his working life, and recognized Elias Rourke from the first second. He put down his fork and asked what Elias wanted. Elias didn't answer. He opened his briefcase, removed a stack of papers, and placed them on the table, turning them so Devereaux could read. It wasn't a threatening letter. It was a statement from an account opened at a small bank in another state, bearing the name of the same service company and showing the same list of small, regular payments flowing out and back in over many years, clean and orderly in the way only someone very careful could arrange. Devereaux looked at the first page, then he turned to the second. His hand stopped halfway down the page. He looked up, and the composure he'd carried for decades began cracking at the corners of his eyes. He lowered his voice and said Elias was making a mistake, that he didn't understand how large this was, that there were people above him too. Elias remained seated with both hands resting on the table. He spoke very quietly, loud enough for only the two of them to hear. He said, "Don't worry. I don't intend to kill you." Devereaux blinked. Elias continued, saying that Devereaux would live, that he would live a very long time, and that Elias wanted him to live long enough for his son to open the newspaper one morning and read the indictment with his father's name printed on the front page. Then Elias stood, fastened his suit jacket, and left the papers on the table for Devereaux to keep. He said the originals were already somewhere else. He walked to the door without looking back. Devereaux remained alone in the diner with his meal untouched, his hand trembling so badly that his water glass struck the tabletop when he tried to lift it. The Holloway name followed Elias throughout the drive home and refused to leave him. He'd heard it twice in the same week, once from Miriam when she told him about the drawer, and once on the bank statement he'd placed before Devereaux, and both times he'd felt the same vague sense that he'd heard it somewhere else, long ago, under circumstances that had nothing to do with the woman lying on the 7th floor. When he reached the house, he didn't change his clothes. He went directly to the study, locked the door, and opened the hidden cabinet behind the bookcase, where the ledgers kept by 3 generations of his family were stored, ledgers no one outside the family had ever seen. He removed the volume from those years, placed it on the desk, and began turning the pages. The writing inside wasn't an accountant's. It was handwritten and concise, each line containing a name, an amount, a date, and a signature in the final column. He passed names he knew, names he'd forgotten, names belonging to another version of the city from another time. Then he found it. Holloway Construction. The entry appeared near the middle of the ledger, written in blue ink, describing the nature of the arrangement in the abbreviated language his family always used, that anything arising at the worksite would be handled quietly, and in return, there would be a regular payment each quarter. Elias read the line. Then his gaze moved to the final column, where the person who had approved it had signed. He recognized the signature immediately, because he'd seen it on every important document in his life, on his birth certificate, on his school applications, on the cards she sent for the birthdays she couldn't attend. Maeve Rourke's signature. He sat for a long time with one finger resting on that line. The woman who had held his hand during her final nights and told him not to let their family name be remembered only for blood. The woman who had allowed a young nursing aide to sit beside her and sing her to sleep without ever knowing the girl's name, was the same woman who, more than a decade earlier, had placed her pen against the line now beneath his finger. But that wasn't what made him unable to lift his hand. Beneath the entry, separated by a blank space, was a renewal. The same company name, the same abbreviated language, but in different handwriting, the writing of a new secretary, and the date beside it was from the spring of that year, only weeks before the morning Andre Sinclair left home and never returned. Elias looked toward the final column. The signature there was his own. He knew exactly where it had come from. It had come from one of those afternoons when Wes placed a thick stack of documents before him, marking every place requiring a signature with yellow notes, and Elias had signed from top to bottom while speaking to someone on the telephone, signing the way a person accepted a delivery, without reading a single line, because these were matters that had continued running on their own for years, and he'd never believed there was anything inside them worth stopping for. He didn't take his eyes from the page for a very long time. Then he closed the ledger. He didn't slam it onto the desk. He didn't push it away. He merely closed it slowly with both hands, the way someone closes the lid of a box, then rested his palms on its leather cover. The desk lamp remained lit. The clock on the wall continued ticking. Outside the window, darkness had fallen completely without his noticing. He remained there until his legs went numb. Then he stood, returned the ledger to its proper place inside the hidden cabinet, closed the wooden door, and moved the bookcase back into position. He walked to the kitchen, took a glass, turned on the faucet, and filled it with water. He drank the entire glass while standing alone beneath the small light above the sink. Then he washed it, dried it with a towel, and placed it upside down on the rack in the exact place where the housekeeper always left it. He turned off the kitchen light. He went upstairs. He didn't call Wes. He didn't call Miriam. Throughout all those years, whenever something happened, his first instinct had always been to pick up the telephone and issue an order, and this was the first time in his life he didn't know what he would say if someone answered at the other end. The woman lying on the 7th floor had lost her husband at a worksite where his family had accepted money to silence whatever followed. And the signature that had allowed that machine to make one more turn, the signature placed there only weeks before Andre fell, had been written by Elias's own hand without his reading a single word. The following morning, Elias arrived on the 7th floor earlier than usual, and this time, he didn't sit in the row of chairs outside the room. He knocked on the door. Naomi told him to come in. She was sitting upright against the pillows, the handcuff removed 2 days earlier after Miriam dealt with the hospital, and resting on the blanket were the phone with the cracked screen and several printed pages blurred with ink. She looked at him and said she assumed he was the person paying for the room. Elias said he was. She asked whether there was anything else he wanted to say. He pulled the armchair a little closer, sat down, and began to tell her. He told the story in order, without circling around anything and without beginning with a single word of qualification. He gave her his name and told her what his family did, using the direct words people usually avoided, never calling it business or a matter between men. He said his family accepted money from certain places to ensure that inconvenient matters went nowhere, and one of those places was Holloway Construction. He saw her shoulders tighten when she heard the name, but he didn't stop. He said the arrangement had begun more than a decade earlier, and the person who approved it was his mother. He said the agreement had been renewed several months earlier, and the person who signed that renewal was him. He said he'd signed it inside a stack of documents he hadn't read while speaking on the telephone, and he said this not as an excuse but as a fact. Then he told her the final part, that the date of his signature was only a few weeks before the morning her husband left home. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't say if only. He didn't say he hadn't known. He simply finished telling her, and sat in silence with both hands resting on his thighs, his eyes looking directly into hers, waiting. Naomi didn't cry. She didn't shout. She didn't throw anything. She sat perfectly still, and her gaze moved from his face to his hands, the same hands that had held her on the scorching concrete at Halstead gas station, then returned to his face. The only sounds in the room were the heart monitor and the distant traffic on the street below. She allowed the silence to stretch beyond the point of comfort, and Elias didn't break it because he understood that doing so now would be an act of cowardice. At last, she spoke in a very calm voice and said she wanted him to leave the room. He stood immediately. He didn't question her. He didn't add a single sentence in an attempt to save himself. He returned the chair to its original place, picked up his coat, and walked to the door. His hand was already on the knob when she called him back. She said she wanted to ask one question before he left. He turned and stood there with one hand still resting on the doorknob. Naomi looked at him and asked whether, that day at the gas station, if the person beside the pump hadn't been her but some man he'd never met, someone with no connection to him, he would still have run toward him. There was no harshness in her voice. She asked as someone asking something she truly needed to know. Elias remained still. He didn't answer immediately. He could have answered at once, and he knew exactly which answer would make everything easier for both people in that room. He stood there long enough for Naomi to believe he might leave without saying anything. Then he said no. He spoke only that single word, adding nothing after it, offering no explanation and no words to soften it. Naomi nodded. She nodded very slowly, her eyes still on him, and there was neither disappointment nor comfort in her face. She said she'd asked because she needed to know what kind of man he was. She said she'd spent years surrounded by people who were kind only in words, people who called to say how sorry they were, people who wrote in letters that her application was under review, and she'd learned that the most dangerous person wasn't someone openly cruel, but someone pretending to be good. Then she thanked him for not lying to her. Elias remained for one more moment before opening the door. In the hallway, he told his two men that from that day forward, they were still to sit there, but if she told them to leave, they were to go immediately, and if she asked who was paying for the room, they were to tell her the truth. Then he took the elevator downstairs, walked out to the parking lot, and sat inside his car for a long time before starting the engine. The letter arrived on an afternoon in the middle of the week, delivered to the 7th floor with her meal tray, and Naomi opened it while still holding her fork. It wasn't from the court. It wasn't from the police department. The envelope bore the name of the County Department of Family Services in one corner, and inside were 2 pages, written in the polite, measured language agencies like that always used, language that never threatened anyone, yet left a coldness running down the spine when the reading was done. They wrote that, in accordance with regulations, an assessment file had been opened, that its purpose was to ensure suitable conditions of care, that a caseworker would visit to speak with her directly in the near future, and that she had the right to have an attorney present. Then, in the middle of the 2nd page, they listed the grounds on which the file had been opened. Naomi read each line. She was under criminal investigation for allegedly resisting a law enforcement officer. She no longer had a valid lease. She wasn't currently employed. And in the final line, the line she read 4 times, they wrote that the cost of her present medical treatment and accommodations was being paid by a third party, that this third party wasn't related to her, and that neither the source of the funds nor the reason for the payments had been explained. Naomi lowered the paper onto the blanket. Outside her door, The two men in plain clothes remained seated in their 2 chairs as they did every day. The private room had a window overlooking the parking lot. There was the armchair where Miriam always sat. Hot meals arrived on time. Throughout the previous weeks, she'd accepted all of those things because she had no other choice, telling herself she would deal with them once she recovered. Now she sat there and understood that the very things keeping her alive were being entered into a file as proof that she wasn't capable. No one needed to write that she was being supported by a man like him. They needed only to state that the source of the money hadn't been explained, and everyone reading the file would understand the rest for themselves. When Miriam came upstairs the following day, Naomi handed her the letter and asked directly how far this could go. Miriam read everything, then remained silent for a moment before answering, and Naomi had learned how to read the spaces between her words. Miriam said this was a routine process, and that nothing had been decided. She said she would accompany Naomi to every meeting. Then she told her the truth, that what they would examine wasn't whether Naomi loved her child, but the lines that could be entered into the boxes on a form: housing, income, guarantor, legal status. She said Naomi needed to be able to stand on her own in the paperwork, not stand by leaning on someone else. Naomi asked whether it would be better if she refused everything he had paid for. Miriam said that transferring her to another section of the hospital now would add another line to the file, and that line would be even worse. She said Naomi was standing between 2 walls, and both were closing in. Naomi didn't sleep that night. Near dawn, she reached for the ballpoint pen on the bedside table and the blank sheet of paper beneath the medication tray, placed it over the cover of an old magazine, and began to write. At the top of the page, she wrote the words, "Things I have." Then she sat looking at the paper for a long time. On the first line, she wrote, "One old car," then stopped to wonder which evidence lot held the car now, and whether it could still be considered hers. But she left the line unchanged. On the second line, she wrote, "Nursing aid certification." On the third, "Experience working at Riverbend." On the fourth, "2 hands that still work." She paused longer before the 5th line, then wrote, "My husband's phone." She intended to continue, but the point of the pen remained suspended above the page and wouldn't come down. She thought of her bank account and knew the number inside it. She thought of relatives, and had known that answer for a long time. She thought of a name she could enter in the guarantor field, and couldn't find anyone whose name wouldn't make matters worse. Finally, she set down the pen. The entire sheet contained only 5 lines gathered together in its upper half, while the lower half remained completely blank. She studied it for a while, then folded the paper in half to hide the empty space, and held it in her hand until morning. Wade Pruitt had been suspended with pay for several weeks, and during those weeks, he went to a bar on the outskirts of Cedar Hollow almost every night. He sat in the innermost corner, spoke to no one, and the regulars had learned not to sit beside him. Late that night, after the bar had nearly emptied, he walked around to the rear parking lot, a gravel yard with a single light hanging from a wooden pole, and stopped beside his car to search his pocket for his keys. He kept searching but couldn't find them. Then he looked up and saw a man standing about 10 paces away at the edge of the light. The man held nothing in his hands. He didn't move closer. He merely stood there with both hands in his coat pockets, watching him. It took Pruitt several seconds to recognize him, and when he did, the keys slipped from his hand and struck the gravel. He didn't pick them up. He stepped backward until his back hit the side of the car, and only then did he look around, toward the entrance to the lot, toward the bar's rear door where the lights had already gone dark, and understand that only 2 people were there. He said Elias's name, not as a greeting, but as a man names something he has continued hoping isn't real. Elias didn't answer. Pruitt began to speak, and once he started, he couldn't stop. He said he hadn't known who she was. He said no one had told him to do what he'd done. They'd only told him to see what she was carrying inside the car. That was all. He was only supposed to look. He said he'd panicked, that the sunlight had been blinding, that she'd reached toward the bag and he'd only thought. He said he had 2 children. He said his wife knew nothing. Then his voice broke, and he collapsed onto the gravel with both knees on the ground and his hands braced before him. And he wept in the way men like him wept only when there was no one left for whom they needed to perform. He looked up and begged. He used very simple words. "Please don't. Spare me. Let me go home." Elias remained still. He looked at the man kneeling on the gravel before him and felt nothing inside himself except a deep, cold emptiness. He'd thought about this moment many times during the previous weeks. He'd imagined it while sitting in his car in the hospital parking lot. He'd imagined it while closing the leather ledger with both hands. And now it was here, far easier than he'd imagined. So easy that it frightened him. There were no witnesses, no cameras, No one in those 3 counties would dare mention his name to the police. He thought about the woman lying on the 7th floor, about the steel handcuff touching the bed rail every time she breathed, about the paper with 5 lines she'd folded in half. He thought about the words on television that had misspelled her name. Then he thought about what would happen if Wade Pruitt were found in that gravel lot the following morning. People would write that the police officer from the gas station incident was dead. They would write that the case had been closed because the accused was no longer alive. And the old news report, the one that called her a female subject who had resisted law enforcement, would remain unchanged in the archives forever, waiting for the day her daughter grew old enough to type her mother's name into a computer. Elias took 2 steps forward. Pruitt recoiled and covered his head with both hands. But Elias only bent down, picked up the keys from the gravel, and dropped them beside Pruitt's knee. Then, in a very quiet voice, he said Pruitt wasn't going to die that night. Pruitt looked up, his face smeared with tears, unable to understand. Elias continued, saying he was allowing him to live not because he deserved to live, but because a woman needed him whole enough to sit in the defendant's chair and hear her name pronounced correctly. He said he needed Pruitt present at that trial, healthy, sober, and sitting upright. He said that if Pruitt considered running, he was welcome to try, and he didn't raise his voice at all. Then Elias turned his back and walked toward the entrance to the lot. Pruitt remained kneeling on the gravel within the circle of light, his keys lying beside his knee, and he didn't dare stand until the sound of the engine on the road had faded long before. Everything began collapsing on a Thursday morning, and it began in the place Elias least expected. Wes Halloran drove himself to the federal prosecutor's office, without notifying anyone, or bringing an attorney, then sat before Camille Ashford's people, and gave a statement. He said he'd been the person who removed the hard drive from the car at the gas station that day. He said that before giving it to Miriam Blackwood, he'd connected it to his own computer, opened the files, and copied them somewhere else. He disclosed every detail calmly and completely, then signed the statement. Miriam called Elias that afternoon and spoke in a voice she'd never used with him in 20 years. She said the data hadn't been lost, and remained completely intact, but it was useless now. She said that once someone had gone on record admitting that he'd interfered with evidence before it reached the investigators, the chain of custody was broken, and every defense attorney would use that fact to have it excluded from the trial. All it took was one person standing up and saying, "I opened it," and the matter was finished. Elias asked what would happen to Wes. Miriam said he would be prosecuted for tampering with evidence, that he knew it, that he'd spent nearly 2 hours giving his statement without offering a single word in mitigation. Elias said nothing more and ended the call. He understood. Wes hadn't betrayed him for money or out of fear. He'd burned the lawful path with his own hands and his own name, leaving Elias only one road, the road his father had always taken, the road Wes had spent his life serving and believing was the only way to protect the people he loved. 3 days later, the retired electrician called Miriam and said he'd reconsidered and no longer wanted to be involved. The following day, the woman from the materials department sent word that she was withdrawing. The third person didn't call or send a message. He simply stopped answering his phone. Miriam didn't ask why, because she'd practiced law long enough to know that when 3 people withdrew during the same week, it wasn't a coincidence, and to understand that there were certain fears outsiders had no right to judge. Then, at the end of that week, when Miriam's people drove to the boarding house on the edge of Cedar Hollow, they found the door to Delia Marsh's room locked from the outside and the curtains removed. The landlord said she'd moved out 2 days earlier, paid in cash, left no forwarding address, and departed before dawn. Her phone rang into a voicemail box that had never been set up. At the same time, on the western side of the city, the Kessler family's people moved through the yards one by one, and the matter was completed so quietly that it made no sound at all. No one called Elias to report it. He knew because no one called him that morning anymore. During the very week when everything fell apart, a young man knocked on Miriam Blackwood's office door at nearly 7 o'clock in the evening. He wore plain clothes and held his hat in his hands, and he stood at the doorway for a while before managing to say his name. Sean Brody said he'd been present at Halstead gas station that afternoon. He said he'd heard his police chief ask first whether anyone had recorded what happened, and he'd stood there and said nothing. He said he hadn't slept through a single night since. He said he knew that testifying would cost him his job, his friends, and the profession his father had once practiced, and he'd spent many weeks thinking about it. Then he asked whether there was still time. Miriam told him to sit down. That night, inside the large house south of the city, Elias Rourke sat alone in the study with his phone resting on the wooden table before him. Throughout all those years, whenever something happened, he'd needed only to pick it up, and someone would answer. He sat there for a long time, considering each name in turn. Wes was awaiting trial. The men at the yards now followed someone else's orders. The woman on the 7th floor had told him to leave her room. He didn't pick up the phone. For the first time in his life, he had no one to call. Sean Brody remained in Miriam Blackwood's office until nearly midnight that evening, and while recounting every detail of that August afternoon, he mentioned one small thing that even he didn't consider important. He said he remembered that when the ambulance left, one of the 2 paramedics had turned back to ask the police chief for the patient's name so it could be entered into the transport record. Miriam stopped writing. She asked whether he meant the emergency services transport record, maintained separately from the hospital file. Brody said yes. The following morning, she submitted a request for the complete record, and 3 days later, a file arrived that was thicker than she'd expected, containing forms, vital sign charts, and at the end of the index, a line stating that a scene audio recording was attached in accordance with procedure. Miriam put on her headphones at 7 o'clock in the morning inside an office where not all the lights had been turned on. The recording began with the engine and siren echoing through the walls of the ambulance, followed by the paramedic's voice reading the vital signs in order. She was about to skip ahead. Then, in the middle of the recording, between the numbers, another voice emerged. It was hoarse, broken, and so weak that she had to listen a second time before she understood it clearly. The voice said its name was Naomi Sinclair. It said, "I didn't resist." It said, "My hands were raised." Then came the paramedic's voice telling her to be quiet and preserve her strength, and immediately afterward, the other voice rose again, more slowly now, one word at a time, repeating those same 3 sentences from the beginning. Then silence. Miriam removed the headphones and sat motionless for a long time. The entire passage lasted only about 9 seconds. 9 seconds captured by a device no one inside the ambulance had thought about that day. Recorded through a procedure the emergency service itself followed merely to satisfy regulations, then left untouched inside a file for weeks while everyone else searched for video footage. No one had tampered with it. No one had opened it. No one had copied it. It had traveled directly from the scene into the emergency services archive, according to proper procedure, and remained there until that morning. Its chain of custody was completely intact, and it preserved the victim's first statement, given at the scene before Wade Pruitt's report had been written, before the police chief had even asked his first question. Miriam called Camille Ashford before the sky had fully brightened. That afternoon, she went to the 7th floor, placed her computer on the blanket, and told Naomi to listen. Naomi heard the entire recording. Then she asked Miriam to play it again. She listened a second time with her uninjured hand resting on her knee and her eyes lowered. She said she'd forgotten doing that. She said she vaguely remembered speaking, but couldn't remember what she'd said. Miriam told her that throughout all those weeks, they'd searched everywhere for someone who could testify for her. And that person had been there from the beginning. Naomi asked what she meant. Miriam said it was Naomi herself. In the moment before she lost consciousness, lying on a stretcher amid the sirens with no one beside her, no attorney, and no one who believed her, she'd done the only thing still within her power, and now it was the strongest piece of evidence in the entire case. Naomi said nothing for a long time. Then she turned her face toward the wall. The following week, Delia Marsh returned. She called Miriam from an unfamiliar number and arranged to meet at a roadside diner, arriving with her phone already placed on the table. She said she would testify. She said she wanted to tell the story again from the beginning and wanted her name included in the official record. Miriam asked why she'd changed her mind. Delia removed an opened envelope from her pocket, without a sender's name or a stamp. Something someone had slipped through the door of the room she'd recently rented in a town more than 2 hours away, at an address she hadn't given to anyone. There was no letter inside, no money, not a single written word. Only a photograph. It showed her mother sitting on the porch of her home with a glass of water in her hand, looking toward the street, photographed from a distance one morning. Her mother was still well. Nothing had happened to her. Miriam brought the photograph to Naomi the following day without saying anything, and simply placed it on the blanket. Naomi picked it up and studied it for a long time, remembering the single question Elias had asked Delia on the front step that day. She put the photograph down, folded it in half, and didn't say a word. The trial opened on a spring morning the following year at the federal courthouse in the city, and the courtroom was already packed before proceedings began. Naomi Sinclair arrived half an hour early, wearing a dark blue coat Miriam had gone with her to buy, and carrying her daughter in her arms. The baby lay quietly against her mother throughout that morning. Naomi's left shoulder was still stiff, so she had to support the child by leaning slightly to one side, a posture many people in the courtroom later said they never forgot. Camille Ashford presented first. She played those 9 seconds of audio in the deathly silent courtroom, played them twice exactly as they had been recorded, and when the sound of the siren faded away, no one moved. Then she called Sean Brody. Then she called Delia Marsh, and the young woman testified for more than an hour, her voice trembling through the first few minutes before gradually growing steady. After that, Ashford placed a small, crumpled piece of paper on the evidence table, recovered from the pocket of the victim's sweatshirt that afternoon, and kept in the evidence room ever since. She held it up for the jury to see and said it was a receipt for $12 worth of gas. She said this was the only thing found on the woman whom the report had described as a subject resisting law enforcement. She set it down and said nothing more. When it was the defense's turn, the attorney rose and asked Naomi whether she had repeatedly filed complaints with government agencies, whether she carried a long-standing resentment toward the authorities and the police, whether she had arrived at the gas station that day already filled with hatred. He asked those questions gently, with an air of sorrowful regret. Naomi waited until he had finished. Then she reached into the pocket of her coat and took out the phone with the cracked screen. She placed it on the table before her. She said the phone contained an 11-second recording her husband had left on the last morning he walked out of their home. She said she had listened to it every day for over a year. Then she said she worked 2 shifts a day, and she listened to that recording in her car before going inside to work, and she didn't have time to hate anyone. The attorney sat down and asked no more questions. When the court permitted the victim to speak, the clerk gestured toward the witness stand, but Naomi didn't go to it. She rose where she was, still holding her daughter, and spoke from there. She said she wasn't going to talk about the gunshot, because everyone in that room had already heard it. She said she wanted to talk about the 4 minutes that came before. She testified that she had turned off the engine. She testified that she had raised both hands to shoulder height and kept them there. She testified that she had said every movement out loud before making it, that she had said her wallet was inside the car, that she was going to reach for it very slowly, that she was pregnant. She said her last foster mother had taught her those things when she was still a child, telling her that people who had no one standing behind them had to say everything they did out loud, so that if something happened, at least someone might hear it. She said she had followed every one of those steps that afternoon. She hadn't missed a single one. Then she stopped, and there wasn't a sound in the courtroom, except for the ceiling fan. In the back row of the gallery, 4 elderly residents from Riverbend had been sitting quietly since the morning session began, brought by the nursing staff. Rosalind sat in the second chair, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes wandering around the unfamiliar room with no understanding of why she was there. She didn't remember what a courthouse was. She didn't remember how far she had traveled to get there that morning. Then she saw the woman standing at the front of the room, and something inside her recognized Naomi, even though her memory couldn't. She began to sing, very softly, out of rhythm, her voice faltering. She sang the same song Naomi had sung her to sleep with during those nights at Riverbend. No one told her to stop. The judge didn't strike the gavel. The entire courtroom sat silently and listened as an 84-year-old woman finished the line and fell quiet. Naomi stood there holding her child, and she let the tears run down her face without lifting a hand to wipe them away, because both her arms were holding her little girl. Then she turned to her left, looked directly at where Wade Pruitt was sitting, and spoke to him. She said she wasn't asking for him to die. She said she wasn't asking for anything for herself at all. She said she was asking him for only one thing, that in everything he was going to say in that courtroom, he call her by her proper name just once. She said her name was Naomi Sinclair, that she had a name, that she had possessed it long before he ever saw her old car in that lot. She said that in every report he had written, from beginning to end, she had been nothing more than the female subject. Then she sat down, and no one in the courtroom could say a single word. The jury deliberated for less than an afternoon. Wade Pruitt was convicted on every charge and received a sentence so long that when the judge finished reading it, he showed no reaction at all. He simply sat there staring down at the table before him. Marlon Gage was convicted of obstruction of justice and destruction of evidence, and the sentence handed down to him sent a murmur through the courtroom because it was far harsher than anything people in that county were accustomed to seeing. Hal Devereaux was tried separately, and he lived long enough to see his name printed on the front page, exactly as someone had once told him he would in a diner one afternoon. The drawer in the records room became the beginning of another investigation, and every workplace accident file connected to Halloway Construction over all those years was reopened from the beginning. As for Elias Rourke, everything unfolded exactly as Miriam had warned him it would that night in his study. When he testified that he had been at the gas station, they asked where he had been coming from, and when he answered, they opened his files. He didn't fight them. He signed an agreement, surrendered everything that remained, and accepted his share of the punishment. He served more than a year at a federal facility in another state, and throughout that time he received no letters from anyone and sent none himself. 2 years after that August afternoon, an old 2-story house in South Philadelphia was renovated and opened with a small wooden sign on the porch bearing the name Maeve Rourke, with the words "Free Legal Aid" written beneath it. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony. They simply opened the doors on a Monday morning and began working. Delia Marsh sat at the reception desk, just inside the entrance, and she was the first person anyone met when they walked in. Sean Brody worked as a civilian investigator, traveling to construction sites, warehouses, and offices to record the things people were too frightened to put on paper. Naomi Sinclair sat in a small room at the end of the hallway, a room with 2 chairs and a box of tissues on the table, and her job was to listen. She was the first person to hear the stories of those who had just been trampled down, people who arrived carrying stacks of documents without knowing where to begin, people who had sent letters and never received an answer. She didn't promise them anything. She simply opened her notebook, wrote their names with the correct spelling, and told them that now someone was reading. She had named her daughter Maeve, in memory of the woman whose quiet warmth had touched her during those long nights at Riverbend. One afternoon near the end of summer, Elias came. He didn't go inside. He stood on the porch holding his hat, and Naomi stepped out to stand beside him. They didn't speak about what had happened. He didn't apologize, and she didn't make any promises. They simply stood there for a long time, looking out across the front yard. Then he said there was something he had never told her. He said his mother had spent her final weeks in the end-of-life care wing at Riverbend, and every evening she had spoken about a young nursing aide who stayed past her shift to sing her to sleep. He said his mother hadn't known the young woman's name, so she had called her the girl with the singing voice. Naomi stood perfectly still for a long time. Then she smiled, and there were tears in that smile, along with something that had finally been allowed to come to rest. Out in the yard, little Maeve ran through a patch of sunlight, holding a wildflower she had picked beside the fence and calling, "Mommy, Mommy," and both adults turned toward the sound of her voice. If this story leaves us with one truth, it is that a person's dignity doesn't lie in the clothes they wear, the car they drive, or the amount of money in their wallet. Some people stand very high and still know how to bend down, while others wear a badge and have never truly seen another human being. And sometimes, what saves us isn't someone else's power, but a truth we struggled to speak at the very moment when we believed no one was listening. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so that more meaningful stories can reach more people each day. How do you feel about Naomi's story? Please leave a comment below, because we sincerely want to hear what lies deep within your heart. We wish you and your family lasting health, happiness, peace, and contentment each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.